Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about the Elsecallers. A lot of people have been asking for this one, especially to me in private, and as well, I've been seeing some interesting things about what people have been saying about how their surges work. So I'm going to give you my thoughts and opinions here, and then you can make a choice for yourself whether you want to be an Elsecaller. So the Elsecallers are interesting because they are kind of just like anyone who wants to improve in something and reach their own potential, which is kind of a strange overall philosophy. In fact, right here, their philosophy is, I will reach my potential. There are people who are always pushing themselves, always self-aware, and always trying to become the best person they can be in some form or matter. So with that being said, Elsecallers are for anyone who has lots of ambition, motivation, and more importantly, channels that in a much more self-positive way. It's not necessarily for those who wish to conquer or those who have grand ambitions for like self-gain. It's for people who want to make themselves better, if that makes any sense to you. So you can pretty much play any heroic path into an Elsecaller, though probably Scholar, maybe Envoy. The two surges that Elsecallers use both intellect and awareness. So even an agent, if you're going down the investigator route, would probably be like perfect, honestly. But any character can really lean into the Elsecallers. And the other interesting thing about the Elsecallers is their ideals are different than most other orders because they're incredibly personal to themselves. So they don't have individual sections for each of their ideals. Instead, they have this kind of combined section where it talks about you set some kind of goal, some kind of thing you wish to achieve. So then when you satisfy your Spren to a degree that they accept for the progress towards that goal, they'll let you speak the next ideal, more or less. And I really like this from a personal standpoint because I'm a self-motivated person. I'm always trying to improve myself in many kinds of ways. And so it's funny that I've never even considered Elsecaller until doing this video, just because now I really get the vibe. Elsecallers are interesting because they are the ones who, of the orders, have some of the most interesting potential, but not the most outward expressed potential. Though I will say Elsecallers then become kind of stock standard when it comes to a character who wishes to become a Elsecaller, right? Whatever your goal is, it doesn't really matter because every character who is an Elsecaller more or less is determined to do a thing and do it well, Where like many of the other orders, like let's take Skybreakers for instance, you can have different expressions of what they view as just or following the law or something like that. Or even with Dustbringers, the first video I ended up doing, the whole self-discipline thing can come across in many different ways, whether it's self-discipline because you're naturally a destructive person or a strong person, or self-discipline because maybe you have a lack of impulse control and you always cause problems. But Elsecallers kind of always fit into a particular niche of, I am going to pursue this track to become the best blank or the best version of myself. So while I definitely like it and identify with Elsecallers for sure, I definitely can see how some of their characters might have a difficulty expressing the individuality between themselves other than by what goal they're actually pursuing, which can be very different and can make for different types of characters. Like a scholar who wishes to gain as much knowledge as possible is definitely going to act and behave very differently than, say, a warrior who wishes to become the best duelist in the world and dedicatedly studies different forms and their opponents and everything like that. Kind of similar, but very different. So it's just something I've thought was interesting about the whole idea of the Elsecaller. But let's talk about their Spren. Ink Spren are very interesting because they come across as these kind of like these oily obsidian statues. And what I mean is here, look at this picture, which by the way, Ink Spren appear the same in both the physical realm and the cognitive realm, though in the physical realm, they have much more control over their size, being as large or as small as they want. But many of the Ink Spren just look like people, though a bit more angular and, of course, with this kind of oily sheen, which I actually really like. I really like that iridescence kind of appearance. It's really, really cool. And Inkspren themselves are very interesting. They have a unique pattern of speaking, which I would find a hard time describing other than the fact that they're quite literal in some ways. And as well, they're very like reserved and very focused. They're not spontaneous like whatsoever. That kind of goes against their nature. Kind of deep thinking is the whole point of an Inkspren. So another thing about generally being an Elsecaller, you get to share an order with one of the coolest characters in all of Stormlight, Jasna Kholin. So that being the case, it's a pretty cool order, but let's go ahead and take a look at the overall talent so you can decide if this order is for you. So starting off with the Inkspren Bond, again, like many of the orders, mostly the same except for the combo ability, which is Elsecaller's Perspicacity. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I'm not going to look it up though because it lets people comment about whether I'm right or wrong. So anyway, while you have Investiture, which is really cool, you gain an advantage on reactions, deduction tests, and tests to peer between realms. And that's anything that happens during a reaction. So if you have a reaction for whatever reason, for any tests or checks during that reaction, you gain advantage. And you only need to have Investiture in order to do this, which is really, really cool. So just by taking this, which by the way, you do need to have 2 ranks in both of your powers. But again, by the first time you level up after taking the first ideal, you're probably going to have that. So Elsecaller's Perspicacity is very, very good. I think it's really interesting, and it makes the Elsecaller just innately really good in non-combat situations. In combat situations too, as long as enemies are proccing your reactions, but more specifically with advantage on deduction tests and to peer between realms, that's all really, really good. And it makes for smart characters in some ways or another. So even if your character is not particularly high in intellect, you can still make good use of this advantage anyway, which I think is really cool. So let's go ahead and take a look at their 2 surges, Transformation and Transportation. Now, I actually misspoke earlier. Transformation uses willpower, not awareness. I messed that one up. But these are 2 very interesting ones. And honestly, these are the ones that take the most kind of brain power from the player to make the most use out of. So let's start with Transformation, for instance. So this is potentially one of the most useful abilities in the game, but also kind of one of the more confusing ones. So more or less, you get the ability to transmute an object into another object. And based on how different those objects are, determines how much you need to make on a transformation test. So let's go ahead and bring up this chart here. And I need to also mention, you can't use transformation on living creatures, at least until you take a talent, and then it gives you a specific attack, which to be fair is overall, I think, better than trying to make the test. Because let's say you're trying to kill someone. I mean, to be fair, transmuting a person's body into any other material would probably be good enough to do significant damage to them. So I think that's why they just made it a straight up attack roll, transformation versus the enemy's physical defense. No, it's spiritual defense. So, you know, it makes a lot of sense, but we'll get to that one here in a little bit. But anyway, so back to the chart I was just mentioning. So you use this chart to determine on the left side of the grid what you're starting with. So let's say a solid, and on the top part of the grid, what you want to turn that thing into. So a solid to a liquid, for instance, is a DC 15. To a vapor is DC 20, to clear air is DC 25, and flame has a little asterisk next to it because you also can't transmute things into fire until you pick up a talent for that as well, but that's also just insanely powerful. So, you know, imagine turning someone's armor into fire would be very, very dangerous, don't you think? And if you haven't watched any of my videos up until this point, how much material you can transform is based on your surge size, which I'll use this graph here to represent. because your how big of a thing depends mostly on how many ranks in the skill transformation you have, which means essentially the size that you can affect is determined by the tier you're in for gameplay, which is a really good balancing element. I also need to make special mention that the amount of investiture that you expend to transform a thing also very much depends on how big that thing is. Using this little section here, you can see if it is a small object, it's a 1 point, medium is 2, large is 3, huge is 4, and 5 is for gargantuan. It's something that most of the time you're mostly going to bother with medium-sized transformations. I'm going to assume maybe large, depending, but you can't do that one at least until you are 6th level. So keeping that in mind, this is a very powerful ability for some pretty obvious reasons. You can turn an obstructing wall into mud or water or just air. You can just get rid of it. You can turn an enemy's objects into such things, though they don't really have rules for using this on enemies to like get rid of their weapons or armor. So I'm assuming you're going to have to make either in addition to or along with your initial transformation tests, you're going to have to make a contested test against their physical defense to target an object that they're currently holding. But I will say, as it's written here, there's no check for hitting an enemy's gear specifically, which feels like a bit of an oversight because that would be one of the first things that I would think to do. And in the section that says transformation on others, it just says you can't soulcast living creatures without the feat for it, though you can creatively use these abilities to be useful and dangerous in combat, but it doesn't say anything about targeting an enemy's stuff. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the talents though, because the talents are super cool. And starting off, we have Soulcast Defense. Now, this is against projectiles specifically, but it's a reaction for either yourself or an ally who's being targeted by a projectile. You can spend 1 investiture to test transformation against the attack roll essentially that the enemy made. So if the enemy is attacking you with like a 14 or a 15, that is the DC you're going to have to make on your transformation test. Even if you fail, though, the projectile grazes, which means that they're going to only do weapon damage die, which is really, really good. And if you succeed, the projectile just completely evaporates into ether. So that's, or essence is what it's called here. So it's really, really good. It's a great reaction to have pretty early on, and projectiles are incredibly dangerous. And honestly, I mean, starting off, you can have a +5 in your transformation by the time you are pretty much getting access to it. So that DC is like a 50-50, and a 50-50 chance of just a graze or no damage is a lot better than honestly taking an additional likely like +3 or 4 or even 5 damage from the attack. So Soulcast Defense is almost always good as long as you have the investiture to spend. Then we have Soulcast Parry. It says you can use Soulcast Defense on melee weapon attacks. Now, this one I don't like because it doesn't answer any questions. For instance, you can now use it on melee weapon attacks, so you can't use this on unarmed attacks. That's good to know. But does this destroy the weapon? Now, by lore, it would. It would necessitate it, because otherwise, how are you defending against something like this? You would need to change that item into something else. But that makes Soulcast Parry insanely good because it's just a boom, instant, get rid of the enemy's weapon. I mean, even if it's like the graze effect, right? Like, it's grazing because of some part of it. Even if we consider the graze doesn't get rid of the weapon or blunts the weapon's blow or something to that effect, like, Soulcast Parry is really, really devastating. And I guess I should mention at this point that you cannot soulcast things that are filled with investiture or invested. So shard blades, for instance, cannot just be whisked away. But this is very, very useful in a lot of situations, though I guess considering how the game is overall designed and one of the main enemy factions, this is not going to be that much of a problem, but I don't know. Soulcast parry, I mean, Soulcast defense initially was fine, right? Because the whole thing was it's a projectile. It's pretty much used anyway. But Soulcast parry asks some very interesting questions that are not answered here. I mean, if we're going by literally what's written, then the melee weapon is similarly destroyed because it says you can now use Soulcast defense on melee weapon attacks as well as ranged ones. Which means, if we go back to Soulcast defense here, it says, on success, the attack instead misses and can't graze you, and you transform the projectile into a material of your choice. If you choose a non-solid material, this destroys the projectile. So if it is the same, then yeah, Soulcast defense is incredibly busted, as it just gets rid of the enemy's weapon unless it's a very special weapon, which is a huge nerf a lot of the time. So this is kind of broken, if I'm going to be honest. Soulcast parry, by what I've read, seems incredibly strong in the setting. And I don't know. I'm going to have to play it. So this is the thing, right? Like I said, there are enemy factions in this that don't use a lot of weapons, and so in actuality this might not be as big of a problem, but I'm really gonna have to play around. I happen to have an Elsecaller in my game, so we might get to see how this works, but as far as I can read right now, Soulcast parry is broken, so it's really good. Next up, we have Distant Surge Binding. This is a very standard one that we see a lot of the times. Increases the distance at which we can transform things rather than from touch to 20 feet, which is really good. I think you can imagine all the ways transformation would be good at 20 feet. Then we have Persistent Transformation. So when transforming non-living objects specifically, your max DC is 15, so the DC can never be higher than 15, which is incredibly good because that means most of the time you just need to make a 50-50 check, and that percentage actually shrinks as time goes on as you put more ranks into your transformation skill and increase your willpower. And in addition to that, additionally, if you fail to soulcast an object, you can attempt to do so again during the same scene. So normally when you try to transform something, it either works or it doesn't, and you can't try again. You fail to convince the object. It's kind of lore stuff, but I'm kind of trying to bring this down to people who are not as familiar with the setting. You try to convince the object to become something else, more or less. So if you fail to do so, you fail to convince it, you can't convince it again. Well, now you can, and if you succeed the test, you must spend 1 additional investiture per time you failed to soulcast that object during the scene. If you can't spend that much investiture, the object won't transform. So persistent transformation is really good because of the flat DC amount, especially because this means that when you get flame casting, which is one we're going to talk about in a bit, you set the DC rather than like 30 to 15, which is very solid, but also being able to reattempt this surge is really good in a lot of exploration or narrative moments, or endeavors as they're called in this game, as you can try to get past an obstacle that you were trying to initially transform. On the other side of the chart, we have the more dangerous stuff. So starting off, let's talk about living soul casting. This is essentially the same as the Surge of Division. It works in pretty much all the same ways. So you spend 2 actions and 1 investiture to make a melee transformation attack against the spiritual defense of the character, plant, or other living organism you're trying to affect. This does base 3d4 spirit damage, which can only be deflected by things that have investiture, which is like shard plate, which is very hard to get. And the size of the damage dice increases with your ranks in transformation. So at 2 ranks, you're going to have 3d6, and at 3 ranks, 3d8, and so on and so forth. If the target is reduced to 0 health by this, they die, and you transform their body into a material of your choice without spending any additional actions or investiture, which is really cool because this means essentially we're getting a discount on investiture, because normally to transform a person, which is a medium-sized object, it would be 2 investiture, but not if you use living soul casting. Now, the same thing with Division. This is really good. Enemies, especially warrior type enemies, are not going to have a super high spiritual defense, and in addition to this, being reduced to 0 HP just instantly kills them, which is solid, especially because enemies that are not minions don't necessarily die when they get to 0 HP. They take injuries. So that being said, this is a great way to just finish an enemy off who is low or at that 0 threshold. And maybe even transforming them into an object can give you fuel for something else you can do, which is also really cool. This is just as good as Division, except Division has more feats orientated towards making this much more deadly and much stronger. So at base, Living Soul Casting is pretty much as good as Division. You just got to be careful. You don't need to worry about any of the DCs though, because this doesn't ask for a transformation test. It just says you're making a melee transformation attack against the spiritual defense of a character, creature, or plant. So that is what that does. Next up, we have blood casting. So you spend 1 investiture and test transformation at a DC 15 to cleanse all poisons from the target and reduce 1 injury's recovery time by 5 days. So this is mostly only relevant if you don't have a party member, or if you have a party member who isn't a radiant of some kind, which is not going to be very common, but it still is likely to happen. So blood casting is not bad. It's just very specific for poisons and more specifically for reducing recovery times, which can be pretty deadly, or not deadly, but can be pretty devastating given how some injuries work. So that's really, really good. Next up down this list, we actually have flame casting, but I want to make special mention of this little connecting link here. You don't get flame casting from blood casting. Its prerequisite is actually soul cast parry, which is really good. So flame casting, you gain the flame as 6th category for your transformations, allowing you to transform things into fire, which you can imagine is very deadly. So when you soul cast flames, attack each character within 5 feet using transformation versus physical, rolling 2d4 energy damage. Now, energy damage is not quite as good as spirit damage, but it is pretty solid. And more specifically, I think the talent doesn't really show off exactly what flame casting does. So here's the full flame casting. You still need to soul cast objects normally against their normal DCs, turning them into fire. But if you succeed the check, it's a free action to make it against the physical defense. So it's not just, another attack ability similar to Living Soul Casting. You do have to successfully transform the thing into the fire that you're attempting to make. And then any creatures who are adjacent to the fire being made, you need to make that transformation test against their physical defense to hit them with that 2d4 energy damage. And similar to many things in this game, this damage increases by an additional die size per rank. So at 2 ranks, 2d6, 3 ranks, 3d8, so on and so forth. Honestly, this is just better soul casting in the sense that when you turn the enemy's armor into water, now you can turn it into fire and burn them instead. It's very solid, and yeah, and I didn't mention this about Living Soul Casting as well. Let me go back to that real quick. Because it's considered an attack, you can graze with it as well. Just thought you would know. So yeah, transformation is just about as deadly, if not more deadly than Division in many ways. I mean, there's a lot. You can turn air into other things. Let's just talk about that a minute. You can transform air into other things. Now, you really can't transform the air inside of a person's lungs, but in their mouths, as long as their mouth is open, yes. It has to be like a contiguous thing that's not necessarily like divided by anything. So you can transform the air into like stone. You could trap someone essentially in stone, and it doesn't talk about how this works. In the transformation on others, your GM will tell you how this is going to get resolved. But yeah, it's really, really good. Let's talk about the last talent here, Expansive Transmuter. So when you soul cast non-living materials, reduce the investiture cost by 2 to a minimum 1. So it's pretty much to 1 for most cases. For example, now if it costs you only 1 investiture to soul cast either small, medium, or large objects. That's really, really good. It just makes you a lot more investiture efficient, which is really good considering you're probably going to be soul casting a lot of the times. And you hear me use soul casting and transforming both. In the Stormlight Archives, the act of transforming something into another thing is called soul casting because you're actually transforming the soul of the object into another object. So that's kind of why it's called soul casting, if that was confusing to you before. Now let's talk about transportation, because transportation is really cool, but a little confusing because the base transportation ability is not what you think it is. So base transportation surge, you spend one investiture or more to look into the cognitive realm where it corresponds to your current location. This allows you to see the true nature of many things around you. For each investiture you spend, you can use one of these effects within your Spren bond range. Now, your Spren bond range, I haven't really mentioned for many of these because they're not super relevant, but it's very relevant for transportation. So initially, it's 30 feet. Which is good, and if you go down the Spren bond, it can get up to 100 feet. Now, the abilities that you get here are pretty cool. First is learn emotions and motives. This gives you essentially advantage on a test to influence a target or utilize their feelings or emotions that they have in like a social situation. This can also allow you to learn a character's motive without needing to make an insight test, which is really cool. That's going to be very, very powerful, as you can imagine, in a lot of social situations. Then we have locate characters. You can look at the flames in your Spren range to guess who is where and what. The flames are living creatures and things as they're represented in the cognitive realm. So when you look at these flames, you could tell, oh, okay, I recognize how this flame moves. This has to be my good friend. And so you can essentially see people through walls is more or less how this power works. Granted, it doesn't have a really good range until much later, but still, it's pretty solid. Then sense investiture. This is probably one of the easiest ones to understand, but you recognize objects or people who have investiture. This is essentially you recognize people who can use magic in the system, more or less, which most of the most important people do. So if you see someone who has power that shouldn't have power, you probably should be suspicious of them. And that's mostly what I'm going to say. You can also see like magic items, more or less, like shard blades and fabrials, which is also pretty cool. So this doesn't sound like transportation at all, does it? Well, that's because transportation is overall really, really strong. And so the base power has kind of been turned into this observation ability, which is why the combo ability, the perspicacity, is the way it is, because it's essentially just you have the ability to gain this advantage pretty much all the time on a variety of things. It's pretty solid. So let's go ahead and look at the talents, because the talents are wild in comparison to what the actual power does. So first we have cognitive foresight. So you can now spot things in the cognitive realm up to a distance equal to 3 times your Spren's bond range. While you have investiture, you can identify north and the direction to the nearest settlement. This is a pretty self-explanatory one, but so with that Spren bond range of 30 feet, it's now 90 feet, which is a lot better. And so that makes locate characters substantially better for you and your group, as well as learn emotions and motives potentially. So you can see what an enemy is doing up on a wall, for instance. That's very, very good. And even since, like all of them, honestly, it's just better to see them at a distance. And if you get the talent that gives you a 100-foot Spren bond range, well, you can see really, really far. And the ability to always know north. And if your character is smart, which, I didn't mention, by the way. So transportation uses intellect. So hopefully your character is pretty smart to make use of these abilities. I'd kind of hope so with how many of them work. But if your character knows roughly where you are and you know which direction is north, navigation becomes a lot easier, and you can even see roughly in the distance in the cognitive realm, like large groups of flames indicating a settlement. So knowing where the closest settlement is can potentially be really good, especially with how weird some transportation type events can happen in the setting. Then we have cognitive vision. So cognitive vision gives us extra abilities that we can use when we use our base transportation surge. So first we get Learn Intent. Make a transportation test as a free action against the cognitive defense of an enemy you can sense. So I don't know why it says as a free action, because this is a part of the surge itself, but whatever. On a success, you extrapolate their likely intentions based on the Spren lurking around them, and you can share this information with your allies. The enemy gains disadvantage on their next test against you or one of your allies. So more or less, you can read what an enemy is about to do before they do it. This is insanely good in combat situations. It just nerfs a particular enemy with the use of your power, which is very solid. So yeah. Something I should mention is you might be then tempted to use this multiple times in a combat round, since you can get up to 3 actions, but in the Cosmere RPG, you can only use a named action once. So you can only use your Surge of Transportation once per round. Same thing with an attack with one weapon in hand. You can make another attack, but it has to be with another handed weapon. So that's how that overall works. Learn Intent is really, really good in combat situations, and it makes you just nerf a particular enemy into the ground, since they have to follow those same rules and typically can't attack many more than one time per round. We also then have Locate Objects. So you briefly search Shadesmar, which, if you're unfamiliar, Shadesmar is kind of like a parallel realm to the physical realm. It's called the Cognitive Realm, and again, they flip names all over the place. I'm sorry if this is confusing, but more or less, if you're on dry land or whatever, you are in a bead ocean where objects are within these little beads that you can see objects inside of. So in a room, you would use this power and you would be able to see individually like all the objects in the room categorized in like these little things. Think of it as like a drop-down menu that gives you a number of each item and a list, a categorical list of all the things in the item. A very insanely good thing to have if you're looking for a particular object around you. And since this is within your Spren bond range, essentially, this can be really good, especially because this is also enhanced by cognitive farsight. So, up to 90 feet around you, you can find any object you're looking for in particular. That is insanely good in a lot of narrative situations. People were saying transportation is just not that good, and I don't know what you're talking about. The abilities here are really, really cool. They just do some very interesting things. And yeah, sure, they're not combat focused, but you have transformation for your combat stuff. You have transportation, and it does have some combat stuff in it, by the way, but you have transportation for all the non-combat things and even some combat things. So I don't know what people are about. It's the TTRPG community. It's really rough out here just trying to enjoy games. You know what I mean? So before we continue down this side of the list, you can see here that they're actually not linked to cognitive vision. So of the vision parts of transportation, we're essentially done. Everything else comes from the more transportation type abilities. So let's go ahead and start on the other side of the list first here. So we get a reaction called Realmic Evasion. Before you're hit by an attack, you can spend 1 investiture and test transportation against the attack, against a DC equal to the attack that is trying to hit you. On failure, the attack just grazes you, and on success, the attack misses. This is really good because now you can just teleport out of the way of an attack before it hits you. Now, I will make special mention that this is very similar to Soulcast Parry, though Realmic Evasion is much higher up on the list, and in that case much easier to get to, but not by too much. And I will say they have relatively the same effects, only Soulcast Parry is stronger because it gets rid of the enemy's weapon. So Realmic Evasion is actually worse than Soulcast Parry. It's easier to get to, yes. And if you're not interested in going down transformation, then there's no reason not to take Realmic Evasion. I like the overall aesthetic of it. I mean, teleporting through an attack is pretty good. But roughly, most things are even, except if you succeed with Soulcast Parry, you destroy the weapon. So Realmic Evasion is really good. Again, if you fail the check, you still only get grays, and if you succeed, the attack completely misses you. But Soulcast Parry is just better. I'm just gonna say it outright. Then we have Realmic Step. This is just straight up teleportation. So as a singular action, you make a DC 15 transportation test, and you spend 2 investiture to transport yourself to any space that you can inhabit anyway within your Spren's bond range, which is at base 30 feet, and Cognitive Farsight does not apply to this because that does not apply to spotting things in the cognitive realm. So 30 feet, maximum 100 feet eventually. Being able to teleport is just good. It's just good. It doesn't matter in what situation. You just teleport. Now, you do have to sense the thing, so you can't just teleport necessarily into a building, but looking into it through a window or something, or maybe it can be argued that you saw it and you walked around the corner and you could teleport in. That could possibly work as well. But one of the interesting things about Realmic Step, and I'm going to show it here in the full example, is this movement does not trigger reactive strikes. So if you're in a really bad spot against a really beefy enemy, well, you now have a way of getting away from them without worrying about them getting a reactive strike on you. And a very interesting thing, and this is very lore related, but if you use this power when you're over a large body of water, this actually only costs 1 investiture rather than 2. That's because in the cognitive realm, dry land is essentially wherever water is. Right. So if you're over water, you're over dry land effectively in the cognitive realm, and vice versa. So I don't know how often that's going to come up for people, but it is interesting, and it does make this ability at least a little bit more investiture efficient. So, I'm not going to argue about that. Overall, it's a really good ability. Again, it's just teleportation. It's just good, no matter what system you're in. And then we have the namesake for Elsecallers, which is Else Calling. So you spend 1 investiture to transport yourself from the physical realm to the cognitive realm, or to test transportation against a DC 20 and spend 2 investiture to transport from the cognitive realm to the physical realm. Yeah, it's actually a lot easier to get to the cognitive realm in the setting than it is to get to the physical realm from the cognitive. So it's not that expensive though, and why would you want to else call? Why would you want to go from the physical realm to the cognitive realm? Well, your enemies and most people are not in the cognitive realm. They're in the physical realm. So if you're attempting to get from one place to another, you effectively get the ability to walk through walls, and your cognitive abilities allow you to also see into the physical realm from the cognitive. So this allows you to essentially ghost walk through areas, but it's not that simple. And I guess the talent is a little misleading here, and I got just misled a moment ago. The DC 20 test I mentioned before is only if you're going from cognitive to physical, not from physical to cognitive. So if you're going from physical to cognitive, there's no test. But if you're going from cognitive to physical, there is a test. But why this isn't so simple is because there's the bead ocean. It's an ocean of beads that don't act like water. You cannot swim through it, and most of the time you will drown in the beads, plain and simple. Now, Elsecaller should have a better ability to get through this, and I'm surprised that we don't have a lot mentioned here about it. All right, so I just had to take a bit of a not break. I had to go through and read through the books. There's not good rules for traveling through the bead ocean. It just says if you're a surge binder, which many of the radiants are, you can spend investiture to create objects in the bead ocean. So else calling is very interesting because as a general feat or talent, I am assuming the intent and design behind else calling is get away from your enemies, move through the cognitive realm to then reappear in the physical realm, and that would make the most sense. But there's just not a lot of rules orientated around this, so that's very confusing. Just consider this ability a ghost walk-like ability where you can just go from one place to another. Will your GM find this a little bit annoying? Maybe. I don't know. This whole game has these kind of moments. But I think it's overall really good and a reason to go down transportation. And I want to make special mention as well. Elsecaller requires that you speak the third ideal, which means all the other talents I'm about to talk to are third ideal or further, which is much later in the game. So just allowing you to kind of ghost walk through the physical realm essentially is, I think, pretty decent. But there are many reasons to also go to the cognitive realm in the game. So just know else calling is really, really good. It has a lot of applications and is very useful. It's just a little confusing as far as the game is concerned anyway. Let's go down to the last in this side before we hop back to the other side of the list here. We have a Realm Walker. So when you test transportation for a talent, you automatically succeed, which means when you use Realmic Evasion, you just automatically avoid people. Now, that makes Realmic Evasion potentially much, much better than the Soulcast Parry. Granted, you need to speak the third ideal to even get to this part, and I would still say there's a lot of benefit to getting rid of an enemy's weapon. But if they're using shard blades, which are very dangerous, Realmic Evasion is better, and by this point in the game, it's just really, really good to be able to just avoid things like shard blades as a reaction. So yeah, Realm Walker is insanely good, especially considering Realmic Evasion. Hopping back to the other side of the list now, we have Shared Transportation. It's the same as Else Calling, except now you can spend 1 investiture per person and more per person to bring with you as when you use Else Calling. So multiple people, and you do need to have 4 ranks in transportation at this point. I would imagine you would. It's good. It just allows you to take your friends with you, which, by the way, you can't else call with your friends. So that is a limiting factor with else calling. I guess I didn't mention before, but I was still kind of stuck in the fact that there's just not really good rules for traversing the beat ocean in the game, which is very, very silly. And then finally, we have Elsegate. Transport yourself and up to 10 companions to an Oath Gate or permanent perpendicularity you visited before. That is a lot of words I'm sure a lot of you don't understand, and the full text is not much better. Mostly what Elsegate means is you will find different teleportation locations in the setting. And not to spoil anything too much for people who are still reading through the books but want to know how they play in the game, but just so you know, this is a really important feature. And though, yes, you do have to be there many times, there is at least one home location I know for sure that this is a very handy ability for. Kind of, depending. There's a lot of weird lore stuff with this, with how it goes in the books. But for all intents and purposes, for an RPG game, this is really good. Essentially, this lets you, after a long rest, bring up to 10 people with you back home or to maybe another location that the teleport locale for. This is a very important ability, very powerful, and most people before this game came out didn't know Else Callers could do this. They knew they could teleport between this realm and that. They didn't know that they could go to a perpendicularity or an Oath Gate. That's insane. If you're a Cosmere head, you know why that's insane. So yeah, the Else Callers are super cool. Transformation and transportation together makes for a very good offensive-defensive mix with some very good skill enhancements. This is probably one of the most well-rounded Radiant paths in the game. It's very solid. It does a lot of things really, really well, and it plays for very specific types of characters who are honestly gonna want a lot of these powers. I really like Else Callers. I'm now very tempted to play one. I think they're very interesting. If anything is a downside to Else Callers, I don't like their Spren too much. Their Spren, a little weird, but generally speaking, I think Else Callers are really cool. But hey, let me know your thoughts and opinions down below. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Lead the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.